I am Matt Grossman. I'm director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University. We had actually planned to have an event on gun issues before the shooting at Michigan State, as it is already high on the agenda and was ripe for evidence-based informed policy. But now it's definitely looking like policy is coming and even more important to move forward. We continue to mourn the deaths of MSU students and to hope for the full recovery of the injured and the traumatized campus. Berkey Hall, where the shooting began, was the home of our institute, as some of you know. Some of our staff have worked in the building for decades, and we're currently displaced. You can even note today that we have the old school name tags in part because we're making do with resources we have available. Obviously it's personal for us, but we felt the need to move forward with our mission of informing policy. Today we have 4 experts who can help us do that, and they have a lot of information, so I want to make sure that we get right into it. Starting with Christopher Smith, who is Professor of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University and the Director of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. He researches judicial policymaking and constitutional rights in criminal justice and is an author, co-author of more than 20 books. Please welcome Christopher Smith.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for attending today. A little note of sort of explanation of who I am and what gets me ascribed as having expertise. So I've taught courses on law and public policy for 29 years at MSU, and I taught similar things in political science at other universities for 9 years prior to that. A few years ago, I was asked to be on the board of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And then through sort of unexpected circumstances, most of the people most active in the organization were older retirees. And at that time, there was great uncertainty, of course, about what COVID would mean, and they felt they needed to step out of being active and going to events, and it just sort of ended up that I was the one who had some knowledge and ability to keep the organization moving forward. But because I still work full-time, the organization in some ways has scaled back so that we are primarily a source of public information about gun safety and gun violence. Our website you can find pretty easily, and there's essays and information about continuing issues, and we also respond to questions from the public and respond to queries from various organizations. I see myself here today with my MSU hat on, but of course I must acknowledge that I do have views about what policies are needed in society. Working in the College of Social Science, we work toward trying to use research-based information in order to solve problems affecting human beings. And I come from that orientation, although my own expertise tends to be in areas of law and policy process. So this is a kind of overview, but it's one with a perspective. Sort of the first general point that I try to make to people is that when we talk about gun violence, we're not talking about one single problem. We're talking about multiple aspects of this issue. And when people explore the issue, often they're surprised to find that the largest number of deaths each year are from suicides. We also have issues of accidental shootings, as well as injuries and deaths from criminal events and other particular aspects related to intrafamily violence, school safety, and a variety of things. So when I speak, I never speak about a solution. I think about ways in which we may try to reduce risk and harm in some of these areas that we may be able to affect through law and policy. And of course, one of the things that we think about is regulating access to firearms and regulating where firearms are permitted to be carried. But we should also take note that there are other kinds of law and policy initiatives which can be beneficial. So we see in various places community and neighborhood programs that may go directly to reducing conflict, or they may be things that seek to reduce some of the social factors that may contribute to contexts in which there is conflict. And when there is conflict with a firearm present, the risk of harm is that much greater. So we can think in terms of community programs, educational programs, job training programs, as well as things like expanded access to health care, mental health counseling, and a variety of things. So I also encourage people to think about law and policy not strictly with a focus on the gun, but also with a focus on social problems, which if we reduce those, we may reduce context for conflict. Sort of my second point of emphasis here, I go back to a quote from Justice Louis Brandeis, which is bandied about by lawyers and judges and legal scholars, in which Brandeis famously characterized the states of the United States as separate little laboratories in which laws and policies may be created as a form of experimentation, and the other states can watch what's happening. And if there are things of value that develop in one state, it adds to the knowledge of other states to think about how they may adapt, adopt, and use these kinds of approaches to address their own problems. And I think that is the case we have in Michigan now as we look at the possibility of having legislation, which was not going to happen previously. I guess my point is we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We can take a look at what other states are doing. The closest parallel to me is to look back at the 2019 state elections in Virginia, where they ended up with an alignment between both houses of the legislature and the then governor, who wanted to take some steps to improve gun safety and reduce risks and harms of gun violence in various contexts. And so over the next 2 years, Virginia then enacted a variety of measures. Looking back at what Virginia did at the time, there's a list of things. This is only a partial list. A ban on civilian carried firearms in state buildings and state capitol grounds, universal background checks, reporting requirements for lost and stolen firearms, safe storage requirements, extreme risk protection orders, temporary ban on gun possession for conviction of certain violent offenses against family members. There were other things related to safe storage at homes that provided daycare, etc. And if you look at what we see, starting with the sort of 3 initiatives from the governor's State of the State address, we see them embodied in what Virginia was doing a couple years ahead of us, and of course what has been done in some other states as well. Again, not to solve the problem of gun violence. It's hard to think in those terms with an estimated 400 million guns in civilian hands, but to try to reduce risk and harm. We can also look at other states, at what they've done, and to think about whether or not that could be beneficial for us. Waiting periods for purchases, limits on magazine capacity, which in effect would force someone with malevolent intentions to stop and reload rather than to continue to fire through the rounds of a large capacity magazine. Having permits or licenses for the purchases of all firearms, not just handguns. And there are other things as well, and we have Dr. Zeoli here, who's nationally known for her research, and I have no doubt she knows about findings related to some of these laws and others. My third area I want to touch on, because I teach about this, is the Second Amendment. And there's a lot of debate at times when we talk about having laws related to firearms about whether or not specific laws violate the Second Amendment. And the points that I tried to make to people begin with this. We need to look at the legal definition of the Second Amendment, not wishful thinking about the Second Amendment. And by the legal definition, what I mean is, what has the Supreme Court actually said in interpreting it? And certainly lower courts are involved in some interpretations as well. But we treat the U.S. Supreme Court as the authority in defining what the amendments to the Constitution mean. I would also point out that the Second Amendment is problematic interpretation-wise because it is a single sentence. The two clauses do not stand alone. And the very first words of the amendment then pose a challenge to the conclusion that it ought to be an individual right to own firearms. But for the moment, the Supreme Court has made some decisions about what that means, even as in the legal community the definition is subject to debate. As people who've gone to law school know, in Supreme Court opinions, the holding of the case represents the rule of law established by that particular decision. The holding answers the issue or the question that has been presented to the court. The holding is the rule of law. Everything else in the opinion is discussion or guidance in some way, but it is not the rule of law. If we look at the three opinions of the Supreme Court defining the Second Amendment, these are the holdings. Began with law-abiding adults can keep a handgun in the home for self-protection in federal jurisdictions like Washington, D.C. Then they said law-abiding adults can keep a handgun in the home for self-protection in states and cities. And they have now said that individuals who are otherwise qualified under state rules to have a permit to carry a firearm are entitled to get that permit without having to provide a reason for why it is they want to carry a firearm. That's it. Those are the rules of law. Those are the rules of law. And when people tell you otherwise, they are asserting their interpretation, or they are asserting wishful thinking, or they are perhaps operating based on something other than looking at what the actual judicial declared law is. If you look at these as the rules of law, you see they leave a lot of room for states to think about laws they might enact that could reduce risk and harm. And in these Supreme Court rulings, some of the language of discussion actually invites legislatures to enact certain gun safety measures. We had in the original case in 2008 establishing this as a personal right, the late Justice Scalia, saying that nothing in their opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of firearms, right? So it was not a declaration of an absolutist right. And we get further confirmation of this view in the most recent Supreme Court case in 2022, where Justice Clarence Thomas acknowledges the ability to restrict firearms away from so-called sensitive places, and he highlights legislative assemblies, polling places, and courthouses as examples, but says he does not purport to present a catalog of what those places might be. So my point here is simply to say, people who fear that the government is going to take their guns away, they have a protection in the Second Amendment, right? But even as that protection exists, the Supreme Court itself has invited states, in effect, to move forward in terms of legislation. Now, we have a new issue that looms over us like a cloud since June 2022, and that is the guidance that decision about being entitled to carry firearms, the guidance that the Supreme Court gave to lower courts in that case. And it said in order for a law to be permissible, judges are supposed to look for historical analogies in laws from 1791 or 1868. This guidance has caused absolute chaos in the lower courts around the country. Absolute chaos. And so it has now been used by various lower courts to strike down laws that would prohibit someone under a personal protection order for committing acts of violence, preventing them from having a gun, laws that would prevent the manufacture of firearms without serial numbers through 3D printing machines. Obviously, in 1868, they didn't have 3D printing machines. This has caused absolute chaos. I have some of those examples here. And I believe that what's going to happen is that the Supreme Court is going to have to accept some additional cases based on these lower court decisions, because their guidance has left many lower court judges thinking that our laws about guns have to be defined by what existed in 1791 with a very racist, sexist, classist society, or in 1868, which had similar problems as well. And there's huge problems that judges are not trained as historians. They selectively pick and choose history, made even worse by a footnote in the case where Justice Thomas admitted that judges aren't trained historians, and therefore they should rely on the history that's presented to them by lawyers on each side in the case. Information presented in an adversarial context is not objective information. It's meant to spin and persuade. And how are judges going to choose between those two versions of history that they're presented? Because one lawyer is more persuasive than another, or because the version of history appeals to their own ideology and personal values? This is quite a mess that's mushroomed very quickly. Should the Michigan legislature be deterred by these unfolding developments in the courts? I say no, because I predict these cases, some of them are going to go back to the Supreme Court. There's going to be a couple justices who are going to be going, wait a minute, this is way more than I thought. And there is the possibility, I think a strong possibility, that a couple justices like Chief Justice Roberts, potentially Justice Kavanaugh, will say, we need a clarification, we need to do something to permit some of these sensible laws to move forward without being struck down because there was no analogy in 1791. So I think legislatures need to move forward and do what they think is best for their own states. Unfortunately, I read an article this morning that the New Mexico legislature is hesitating to act precisely because of what they're seeing out in the world. I would hope the Michigan legislature will not hesitate, but will move forward with the laws they think are best for the state. They're challenged in court, that's part of the process, and you defend your laws in that forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we're pleased to have April Zeoli, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan, but maintains her old Spartan credentials, and is at the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention, and has published a lot of research on the prevention of firearm violence, including intimate partner violence and homicide through the use of policy and law, and a lot about interstate differences. So we're pleased to have April Zeoli with us.
Okay, I am April Zeoli, and I've been studying firearm policy and intimate partner homicide and homicide in general for 19 years. I'm going to talk today about extreme risk protection orders and also some domestic violence related firearm restrictions. But when we get to the question and answer portion of the event, I've spent 19 years just eating and breathing and sleeping firearm policy and can answer whatever types of questions you have. So first I'm going to present some research that I recently published on the use of extreme risk protection orders in response to threats of multiple victim and mass shootings. And I'm happy to say that two of my research assistants on this project, Jen Pruk and Ryan Mann, are in the audience. So this research was funded by the National Collaborative on Gun Violence Research, and the views are my own, not theirs. So extreme risk protection orders, you probably have heard them called red flag laws, and there is an extreme risk protection order bill up in the Michigan legislature right now. These are court-issued civil orders, not criminal, civil orders, that temporarily suspend a person's ability to purchase and possess guns. And it does this for people who are deemed by a judge in a civil court to be at imminent risk of harming themselves or others. What happens is that if someone is a risk for suicide or violence against others, either a law enforcement officer or much more rarely family members will go to the court and take this evidence and petition the civil court for an extreme risk protection order. And it's up to the petitioner to show by, depending on the state, clear and convincing or preponderance of the evidence, that this person is a risk to themselves or others. At that point, a judge will issue an extreme risk protection order if they've met that statutory level of evidence. And that person, their name will be put in the background check system so that they can't legally purchase a gun. And any guns that they already possess should be removed by law enforcement or otherwise relinquished by the person under this order. Currently, extreme risk protection orders are in place for 19 states and the District of Columbia. Those are the states in orange, and including the white and orange lines. The 6 states with the horizontal and diagonal white and orange lines are the states that are in the study I'm about to tell you. We studied 6 states: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Maryland, and Washington. And what we did was put in public records requests in 5 states and a restricted data use agreement in Maryland to get access to all of their extreme risk protection order petitions, all up to June 30th, 2020. And we looked at all of these petitions and gathered the information in them and coded them. We coded 6,700 plus petitions, And I heard just last week that in the United States there are a total of 22,000 extremist protection petitions thus far, which means that I and my team have coded over 25% of the extremist protection orders that are in existence. So anyway, we coded this information, and then we looked at why the petitions were made. So why did someone feel a need to go to the court and say this person is at risk of harming others or themselves? And what we particularly looked at in this study was threats to commit a multiple victim or mass shooting. And we defined this as a threat to shoot 3 or more individuals, not including a suicide threat, or a threat to shoot up a location in which 3 or more individuals could be assumed to be present, like a grocery store or a restaurant or a pharmacy. And this is a descriptive analysis of what we found. So I mentioned we coded over 6,700 petitions. 10% of those, or 662 of these petitions, were for those mass shooting threats. The vast majority of the people who had made these threats were male. The vast majority, well, 3/4, were white. And the mean age of the people who made these threats was right around 35 years old, except when the threat was against a K through 12 school. When the threat was against a K through 12 school, the person who made the threat was much younger, an average age of around 20 years old, and a large percentage of them were minors. We looked at whether they had access to a gun and their criminal histories, and we found that 7% of these people recently acquired a gun, or at least their extremist protection order file said that they recently acquired a gun. And 65% of them were known to possess a gun already. 27% of them had recklessly used or unlawfully brandished a firearm in the past. And 26% of these people had used violence against others. 46% of them had a criminal history that could involve an arrest up through conviction. And we know that about 10% of them were previously convicted. And again, I want to stress, we only know what was in the petitions themselves. So this is likely an underestimate of all of these things. Because if the law enforcement officer filling out the petition didn't write previously convicted for, then we wouldn't know. We found that the mass shooting threats took a different nature. There were many different kinds of mass shooting threats, and I want to go through these different kinds. The first was the maximum casualty mass shooting threat. About 50% of the threats were this type. And this is what we think of as the public mass shooting. Sorry. These are threats to shoot up a location, essentially. They want to go to a school or a park or some other type of public location, and the goal seems to be to kill as many people as possible indiscriminately. And then we had what we called the named target threat. And this is when they really wanted to kill particular people. This wasn't that indiscriminate public shooting. It's, I am threatening my wife and our children, for example. So it was really about particular people and shooting them. And again, this had to reach the bar of at least 3 or more victims. Then we had what we called the implicit threat. And these are where the threat isn't actually verbalized, but it's there. For example, there was a case where a cheerleader mom was at a park cheerleading practice, had ended, something had gone wrong. And she went to her vehicle and she got a gun and she pointed it at the crowd. She didn't say, "I'm going to shoot you all," but it seems, when you're pointing a gun at someone, that seems a clear threat. And she was pointing a gun at many, many people. And then we had conditional threats. These are the if-then threats. A lot of these were centered around accessing drugs or other medication, calling pharmacies, going to pharmacies. If you don't give me the OxyContin, then I'm going to shoot you all. Then I'm gonna go back home and get my gun and come back here and shoot up the place. Then we had contextual threats, which were about 5%. And those are threats that would have been a mass shooting had they been carried out, but it wasn't necessarily that somebody was trying for a mass shooting or wanted to commit a mass shooting. For example, we had a woman who was very irritated that the neighbor children were making a whole lot of noise outside. And so she, got a gun from her home, she went outside with the gun, she pointed it at them and said, "You'd better be quiet or I'm gonna shoot you." So by virtue of there being 4 children there, it would have been a mass shooting had she done it. And then there's the response to first responders. This is where something else is going down. Police have been called to the scene, and it turns into a mass shooting threat. For example, if someone is suicidal and police are called to the scene, and then the suicidal individual says, "Don't come in this room. I'm gonna kill you all if you try to come into this house." And there are, multiple police officers there. So I want to go a little bit more into depth in just 2 of these, the maximum casualty threats first. Again, this was about 50% of the threats. And 33% of those were threats to shoot up K through 12 schools. 31% were businesses. They were, hospitals, pharmacies, restaurants, lots of Walmarts, some amusement parks. And then healthcare facilities, the businesses, I should have put hospitals under healthcare facilities, so hospitals, pharmacies mainly. And then law enforcement, lots of people who just wanted to take out law enforcement. And then 5% were hate crimes, so somebody threatening to shoot up a Black Lives Matter protest, for example. 10% of these included a suicide threat, and 6% of these posted the threat on social media, which is a somewhat small percentage than we were expecting. We expected a bit more, since many of these seem to be kind of statement, they want to make a statement with this mass shooting, but it seemed a bit rare that they posted this on social media. But again, we only know what was in those reports. And then the named target threats. This was mostly about intimate partners and families. So people who wanted to kill their intimate partners and all those children, the children that they had, or mom and dad, brother and sister, other children. We did have some particular law enforcement officers that were targeted. So they're going to kill, an officer maybe they tangled with in the past, and people around them. And then there were some people that were targeted in businesses with these threats. So there was a case where somebody called up a restaurant. He didn't like the service he received the night before, so he made this threat against that waiter and whoever else happened to be there. 10% of these also included a suicide threat. And I just want to mention that murder-suicide is most common with an intimate partner homicide. So intimate partner homicide, suicide, is the most common type of murder-suicide. So we weren't really surprised to find 10% made a suicide threat. And 4% of these shots were actually fired. And only 1% posted that threat on social media. 93% of these petitions were granted at that ex parte or temporary stage. That's where there hasn't been a hearing yet. The judge evaluates the evidence and decides whether this meets the criteria of being an emergency that has to get that extreme risk protection order right now. And in 93% of the cases, the judge said, yep, this needs it right now. 92% of cases had a full order requested. So not all cases went to that full order stage. 92% of them did, where there was a hearing. And of those, 84% were granted, suggesting that the vast majority of these cases were those that judges found credible, that met their statutory, evidence guideline for imminent threat of harm to themselves or others. So the implications of this are that we do see these distinct types of mass shooting threats, and that may help us in the future figure out, what types of risky behaviors are going into making these threats. Who, do we really need to worry about? In science, we're always looking to get more nuanced and, figure out who do we really need to be worried about so that we can really put all the interventions, we have that might work towards that person instead of, worrying about the people that we don't necessarily need to worry about. The petitions were also filed against minors, those who were too young to legally purchase a firearm. And this mainly happened in Washington and Florida. And often what this looked like was a law enforcement officer, talking to the parents beforehand about the parents' guns or the guardian's guns in the household and making sure that the child couldn't access those guns. And if the law enforcement officer wasn't satisfied that the child wouldn't be able to access those guns, then they would move towards the extremist protection order petition. We also, again, found that these petitions almost always met the court's evidentiary standard for issuing an ERPO. I'm going to move briefly in my last 5 minutes to intimate partner homicide and firearm laws. So this graph shows intimate partner homicide counts over time from 1975 through 2017. And the top blue line is intimate partner homicides committed with a gun. The green line are intimate partner homicides committed with other weapons, so not a gun or knife. And the red line is intimate partner homicides committed with a knife. And on your left are female victimizations, and then on your right are male victimizations. And what we saw for a good couple decades was that intimate partner homicide counts went down from 1975, to 2014-ish. Much steeper decline for intimate partner homicides among men than among women. And if we were to look at this by race, we'd also see a much steeper decline for intimate partner homicides among the white population than among the black population. Now, in 2014, we start seeing a climb in intimate partner homicide. And if this did extend to 2020, we would see a continued climb in intimate partner homicide. And it really is solely an increase in intimate partner homicide committed by guns. Intimate partner homicides committed by knives and other weapons haven't really gone up. But intimate partner homicides committed with guns have gone up quite substantially in the last 6-7 years. We do have some interventions that look like they help decrease intimate partner homicide. Specifically, domestic violence restraining order firearm restrictions. So a bunch of longitudinal state and city level studies at this point have found that, we're in Michigan, I'll call them personal protection orders, personal protection order firearm restrictions are associated with reductions in intimate partner homicide committed with firearms and in total intimate partner homicide. The decrease in total intimate partner homicide is important because it suggests that people aren't just using other weapons. We hear a lot, if somebody can't get a gun, they're just going to kill somebody some other way. But research doesn't bear that out. And part of the reason we think research doesn't bear that out is because guns are simply far more deadly than any other weapon. That's why people want guns for home protection, right? That's why when you say, well, just use a knife for home protection, people say, no, I need a gun. Because it's more deadly, we know this. In this study that I did, we looked at the differences between state laws and whether some of those differences might be associated with greater decreases in intimate partner homicide. And the differences we looked at were whether those restrictions covered dating partners. Many states and the federal government don't cover dating partners. So if you're just dating and never had a child with them or lived with them, you won't get the firearm restriction. We looked at whether they cover ex parte orders, those emergency orders that go into place very quickly. And we looked at whether the state law had a section that said that the judge is authorized to order relinquishment of any guns the now prohibited person has. And what we found was that all three of these seemed to be important. When the PPO firearm restriction was extended to dating partners, we saw an associated 13% decrease in intimate partner homicide. And that makes sense because right now in the United States, dating partners commit the majority of intimate partner homicides. And Michigan has that law, by the way. But in Michigan, it's discretionary. We don't know how often judges are actually ordering that. When a state has these restrictions available on personal protection orders, there's a 13% decrease associated with that. And Michigan has that law as well. Again, it's discretionary, but we have it. And then when a state law has that relinquishment provision that says a judge can order them to relinquish any guns they already possess, there's a 10 to 12% decrease in intimate partner homicide. And that makes sense because without that provision, without that relinquishment provision, what happens when somebody is prohibited from possession? Not much of anything. Often by default, they are allowed to just keep their guns at home. And that doesn't safeguard anybody. But by requiring them to turn in the guns they now possess illegally, lives might be saved. And Michigan doesn't have that law. So that is my presentation. And again, I'm happy to talk about all of these things and more afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're now pleased to hear from Kelly Sampson, who has traveled in to speak with us today, but back home, originally from Detroit, and is now Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Policy at the Brady campaign, and works on making the connection between gun violence prevention and racial justice. Kelly Sampson.
Hi everyone. I just want to thank you all for coming and being part of this conversation and taking your time to engage with these issues. So when you think of ending gun violence or gun violence in general, I'm wondering what comes to mind for you. Do you think about evil or culture issues? Maybe you think about school shootings or suicide. Or maybe for some of you, you even have to think about someone that you know who's been personally impacted. But do you consider gun suppliers and the money that they make, the privileges that they enjoy from the legal system? If you don't, the goal of my talk today is to help you engage with the role that the gun industry plays in gun violence. I'm going to talk about what that role is and what types of policies could change it for the better. I'm here with the Brady Center, and we were founded in the name of Jim Brady, who was Ronald Reagan's press secretary and who was shot when there was an attempt on President Reagan's life. We work with gun owners and non-gun owners to take action to prevent gun violence. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for American kids, and that's a public health issue, not a private evil hearts problem. There's no prevailing philosophy, theology, or world history to suggest that evil is unique to the United States. What is unique, however, especially in comparison to our peer countries, is the rate at which gun violence kills our people. That's not because we're more evil, more prone to mental health diagnoses, or more violent. First, research shows that Americans are no more prone to mental health issues than people around the world. Second, America isn't necessarily more violent than our peers, but because guns are so readily available, we are decidedly deadlier. When it comes to gun violence, we're quite literally off the charts. That's why countries like Australia, Canada, and Germany even warn their citizens to take extra precautions when they travel here. And that's also why hundreds of families will get the dreaded news that their loved one has been shot this very day. So in the face of such horrific violence, it's understandable for people to earnestly believe that the answers lie in the individual, private sphere of morals or hearts. But we have to be honest. America has a gun violence problem unlike any other industrialized country on earth. And American gun violence is a public health problem that requires public policy solutions, including a comprehensive system of regulation related to firearms. Gun violence in America has many forms, each of which have root causes that cannot and should not be dismissed or ignored. But the one thread that links them and that differentiates us from other countries is the way that we allow access to firearms and the way that we don't regulate the firearms industry. So the case I'm trying to make to you today is that gun manufacturers, gun distributors, and gun dealers are inextricably linked to our issues with gun violence. The firearms industry, which again, when I say that term, I'm really referring to manufacturers, dealers, and distributors, they play a role in facilitating easy access to firearms by preventing regulations and avoiding transparency, accountability, and oversight. Now, people who are opposed to regulation often will say that if someone wants a gun to commit violence, they'll just circumvent any law to do it. They'll turn to the black market, for example. But the black market is not an inevitable or naturally occurring phenomenon. It's an unlawful, irresponsible, and negligent gun industry business practices, both at the dealer and manufacturer level, that sustain and feed the black market. So there's things that we can do to change it. And too often, gun policy discussions tend to equate enforcing gun laws as enforcing only those laws governing gun users as opposed to laws governing gun sellers. And that's especially true in regards to placing America's gun violence and gun homicide problem solely at black and brown people's feet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about guns and race for a little bit, and I know that in the United States, both of those topics they're not neutral. People have a lot of feelings about both. But the reason why I bring them up is because it's an elephant in the room, especially when we talk about gun homicide, and we need to address it. The United States is a global outlier when it comes to gun violence. According to a study published in the American Annals of Medicine, the United States firearm homicide rate is, quote, 25 times higher than that of comparable countries, and our suicide rate is 8 times higher. But when it comes to gun violence within the United States, Americans of color, especially black people, are outliers within the outlier. The Violence Policy Center, for example, published a study in 2016 saying that while black people were only 13% of the American population, we account for 51% of the total homicide victims. And the vast majority of those homicides are gun homicides. So behind these deaths, there's a market. And too often, that gets totally left out of the narrative, and instead, people will shift the blame and say, well, that's just a gun problem, it's a culture problem, it's a terrible term, black on black crime problem. But there's a market behind these deaths. And one of the things we did at Brady is we found that guns often flow from the gun industry, which, as you'll see, often will set up shop in white suburban communities into black communities. So through FOIA requests, we obtained data from the ATF, which is the federal agency that's responsible for regulating the gun industry and other industries. And we looked at some states. We looked at California, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, and Wisconsin, and found that the people responsible for selling or managing a federal firearms license, which is the permission that you need to be able to make a business of selling firearms, the vast, I cannot say that enough, majority of FFLs or people responsible for an FFL are white. And that's important for me to name because it refutes this popular notion that when we're talking about urban gun violence, that is chiefly a problem that starts and stops with black or brown people living in city limits. Chicago, I think, is a really good example of this. Many of you may know that Chicago is sort of a favorite punching bag for people who want to paint gun violence as sort of a culture issue that's removed from the law. I'm not sure if you know this, but there's not a single gun store in the city of Chicago. However, Cook County, which is the county right outside of Chicago, it plays an outsized role in supplying crime guns there. And one of the things that you'll see if you get into this issue of guns and the gun industry is that by design, there's a data black hole. It's really difficult to get data. That's not by mistake, that's on purpose, because the federal government has passed laws making it harder for us to know what's happening. They don't want us to know what's happening. However, the city of Chicago has found a way to sort of get around some of those federal laws and allow us to take a look and see what's happening in the market. And in 2017, they analyzed their available gun trace data from 2013 to 2016 and found that the federally licensed dealers primarily located in Cook County were the original point of purchase for approximately 2 out of every 5 crime guns recovered in Chicago. And that is nearly identical to another study that the city had done from 2009 to 2013. And outside Cook County, a lot of the other crime guns were coming from Indiana. So that sort of shows that if you're going to talk about gun violence in cities like Chicago, or the state of Michigan like Detroit or Flint, you have to talk about the suburbs too. But we don't. Even just think about former President Trump. He would often say, you know what's wrong with Chicago? It's the Democrats. It's the people there. They have tough gun laws after all, so like, what are they doing? But if you look at the market, you can see that you can't just stop at Chicago. You have to actually look outside of it. And the same thing is true in our state as well. We even looked at the 208 people responsible for operating federal firearms licenses in Wayne County, which is home to Detroit, and found that 92% of them are white. Yet according to the 2010 census, Wayne County is only 54% white. And if you look at the gun statistics in Wayne County, especially gun homicide, which is different than suicide, it's mostly people of color. So I make this point again, not to be controversial or bring up a lot of feelings, but to make the point that when we're talking about gun violence, you have to look at the whole universe. And so much of the illegal or irresponsible activity that happens with gun violence happens long before anyone pulls a trigger. So what am I talking about with that? Again, I just told you about the market and the role that it plays. All guns, or I shouldn't say that, not anymore, because we have 3D printing and ghost guns. However, the vast majority of guns right now are still produced in licensed manufacturers' factories. So generally what happens is that a manufacturer will produce a gun, they'll sell it to a distributor, that distributor will sell it to a dealer, that dealer will sell that gun to the public. Now, dealers should screen for signs of gun trafficking, such as straw purchases, and most do so thoroughly. So that's another point I want to make. If you came away from my talk thinking that all gun dealers are bad or all gun dealers are irresponsible, then I've done something wrong. Because that's not true. The majority of gun dealers won't sell a crime gun in a given year. So most gun dealers are thorough, they're following the law, they're being responsible. That's important though, because that small number of dealers who are being negligent, they're having an outsized influence on gun trafficking and gun crime. According to the last available data, which I will admit is somewhat old because of those federal laws making it hard for us to get data, but according to the last available data that we do have, only 5% of the licensed dealers sell about 90% of the guns that are later recovered in crime. And we have data we have information, not just that data, but then also industry insiders have doubled down on that and let us know that that small number of irresponsible dealers, because again, most dealers are quite responsible, but of that small number of irresponsible dealers, they sort of turn a blind eye to gun trafficking. And we know, because of the ATF and the fact that manufacturers get traces on which dealers or distributors are routinely selling crime guns, that there's an awareness. And because the majority of gun dealers do not sell any crime guns, if you're a manufacturer and you see that one of the dealers or distributors that you're working with has multiple traces traced to them in a given year, that is a red flag, because most dealers won't have any. So a responsible manufacturer, when they keep seeing over and over that mom and pop gun shop is selling crime guns, they should investigate, look, and maybe compel that business to reform or cut ties with them. That rarely happens though. Manufacturers are sort of willing to turn a blind eye to keep profiting. And what's worse is that they know that when they decide to act irresponsibly, they'll face little enforcement or oversight. And for sake of time, I'll just give you an idea of what that looks like. So Robert Ricker is a former NRA attorney, and he had an interview with 60 Minutes where he talked about how manufacturers, quote, know full well what goes on at the distributor and dealer level. Similarly, there was a Wall Street Journal article with Robert Lockett, who was the then owner of the Second Amendment gun shop and the one-time National Alliance of Stocking Gun Dealer of the Year, and he wrote an article chastising gun manufacturers saying, you know, you're putting your heads in the sand. So there's an awareness there. And the government as well has put the industry on notice that when they turn a blind eye, they're sort of facilitating crime. In 2001, the US DOJ issued a public report finding that, quote, gun manufacturers and importers could substantially reduce the illegal supply of guns by taking steps to control the chain of distribution for guns. But despite all of this awareness, including awareness from lawsuits against the industry, there's very little change. And the reason why is because of a law called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. I'm going to call that PLACA for the rest of the talk. So if you're not familiar with PLACA, it's a law that was passed in 2005. President George Bush signed it into law. And it is effectively an attempt by the gun industry to make sure that it doesn't have to face the consequences of its actions, basically exempting it from civil suits. Now in the United States, we tend to, in comparison to a lot of other countries, have less strict regulation on the front end because we have a tort system on the back end. And that's sort of where you see a lot of reform. So I'm in Michigan, my family worked in the auto industry, and so we know about sort of these famous examples of cars, for example, that have been reformed because of lawsuits. And you also are all probably familiar with the truth commercials that were getting at the dangers of tobacco. That's a result of a lawsuit holding the gun industry accountable. So it's not unusual for the public to hold industries responsible for their negligence via lawsuits. But when it comes to the gun industry, because of PLACA, it's a lot harder to do that. And what's worse is that the gun industry also doesn't have a lot of regulation on the back end. So PLACA, contrary to how some people describe it, is not a complete immunity law, but it does make it much harder for people harmed by industry conduct to get their day in court. So what PLACA does is it prohibits qualified civil liability actions against the gun industry. That's basically saying that if a tort claim, so if someone sues resulting from a third party's criminal or unlawful misuse of a firearm, you can't sue the gun industry for someone else's conduct. But PLACA allows 6 types of claims, including actions against sellers and manufacturers who knowingly violated a federal or state law, including negligent entrustment, negligence per se, and products liability claims. So PLACA doesn't protect the gun industry from lawsuits that would be based on someone else's negligence or someone else's irresponsibility. And it does make it harder for people to follow the traditional legal path to the courthouse, but it doesn't cut everything off. And so one of the things that's important from that, and I'll talk about this towards the end, is that because PLACA allows individuals to bring claims according to a state law, then when Michigan's thinking about passing firearms legislation, passing laws that regulate dealers and distributors in the state is a really important way to holding the industry accountable. And I'm not sure exactly how much time I have left, but I know I'm coming to the end. So what I'm going to do is just end it there and say that I hope I've at least convinced you, if you weren't sort of aware of the industry's role, that they play a huge role. And that as we're thinking about policies, in addition to what's already been named, passing laws and policies that hold the gun industry accountable, which, by the way, is not different than other industries, it's just sort of correcting what's gone wrong, would do a lot to not only protect people on the back end, but also hopefully incentivize the industry on the front end to be more responsible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have Christopher Kierkus, who is a professor at Grand Valley State University in the School of Criminology, specializes in policy evaluation, and is published in Firearm Policy. Christopher Kierkus.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for inviting me to the forum today and to giving me the opportunity to share my perspective on some of these issues. I will just briefly say that I guess it's a little bit of a double-edged sword to be presenting last. in that my colleagues, my learned colleagues, covered many of the issues that I wanted to talk about today. So I'm going to try to focus on those that they haven't covered, as well as certain things that I may have a different perspective on. Very briefly, by way of background, I'm a professor at Grand Valley State University, been there for 19 years. I do evaluation work, I do criminological work. I'm a stats and methods geek, so I do a lot of quantitative work related to various policies. The other thing that I'll share about you is, originally I'm from Canada. I grew up just outside Windsor, Ontario. Came to the U.S. in the early 2000s, and if you were hearing me do this presentation in the early 2000s, I think I would have essentially said, my colleagues covered the entire issue, I agree, thank you very much, and sat down. I honestly didn't understand the gun issue in the United States, why there are so many firearms here, why people are so passionate about having them. And it seemed very obvious to me as a criminologist in the early stages of my career, having one graduate degree, that it has to be guns that's part of the violence problem, or even the main part of the violence problem. I've changed my mind on a lot of those issues, and I've changed my mind because of the research that's out there. I owe a debt of gratitude to the late Dr. Alan Lazat, former dean at SUNY Albany, where I did my Ph.D., who showed me, in no uncertain terms, that I was wrong about many of my assumptions pertaining to firearms. So let me share with you what I think now about some of these issues. Starting with the one that I think is first and foremost on most of our minds, why are we here today? Because of these folks. I suspect many of you will recognize these faces. This is the tragedy we had at Michigan State University, as well as at Oxford High School in the previous years, and the young people who will not get a chance to live out their lives. We want to come up with ways, effective ways, to prevent this from happening, so that folks like this or their families never have to suffer what these individuals did and what their families did. So the question, of course, is how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? We want to reduce gun violence. We want to save lives. But we have to be really careful when we choose our policy, because any of you have studied public policy. I know a number of my colleagues have. I suspect many in the room have. If we make bad policy decisions, if we pass bad laws, not only do we waste resources, sometimes we make the situation worse. That's a very real possibility, folks. Bad laws can actually make the situation worse as opposed to better. So we really need to focus on evidence-based practice. Okay, what does the scholarship tell us? What works and what doesn't work? And not go down rabbit holes because we are passionate. It's natural that we're passionate about this issue, okay, but passion can and very often has led us down bad pathways that lead to either ineffective policy or counterproductive policy. There is a lot of science on this. The National Academy of Sciences twice reviewed the literature on firearms violence in 2005, and more recently at the behest of President Obama in 2013. They reached some very good consensus about what works and what doesn't, especially what doesn't. And one of the things that vexes me no end, folks, is that many of the things we know don't work keep on getting done. Okay? Gun buybacks is probably the best example of that. We have those constantly in Michigan. We have them in Grand Rapids. We've had a few recently. I know you've had some in Lansing recently. They don't work. Essentially, every piece of research that's out there suggests that they don't work, and then yet we keep doing them. So we need to move beyond that. We need to do better. We need to follow the science. That's a phrase we've all heard a lot in the recent past. Some realities when it comes to firearms violence in our country. And again, my colleagues have addressed a lot of this. The Constitution, the Second Amendment, SCOTUS, precedent on them, we have to be mindful of those. There's not much point to passing laws that are not going to stand constitutional muster. So I do think, I slightly disagree with my learned colleague. I do think it's important for legislatures to be aware of that and to legislate accordingly. I do absolutely agree with my colleagues that we need to diagnose the problem. In other words, gun violence is not all the same. We need to think about what type of gun violence are we discussing. We need to figure out what the causes of that are empirically, and then we need to design policy to address that. Because blanket laws that treat it as one public health issue or one crime issue are very likely to be ineffective. That's what the research tells us. We have to be aware of the fact that we have a huge critical mass of firearms in this country. Estimates range between 300 and 600 million. I know my colleague said 400 million. I don't dispute that. We don't know, but it is huge. It's much larger than in any other country. And because it is a constitutionally protected right to bear arms, those guns aren't going anywhere. So I always think we have to keep that in mind when we are legislating. We also have to be aware of the fact that the vast majority of both firearms and firearms owners are never involved in crime, or never involved in suicide, or never involved in anyone being hurt. And that firearms have very legitimate uses. Self-defense, there's research out there that suggests if someone is attacking you, someone is robbing you, your most effective defense, your best chance of not getting hurt or killed, is to resist with a firearm. One of the reasons why I think we ought to take that right to self-defense and the right to bear arms seriously. Hunting and sport. I learned something a couple of years ago from a new friend of mine who was a hunter. There are families in the UP that rely on firearms for the majority of their nutrition, the majority of their protein. Okay, that's how big of a deal it is, and I think we have to be mindful of that when we legislate. And jobs. The gun industry is absolutely a bit of a double-edged sword as well. Hey, but it supplies 375,000 jobs and $70 billion of business in the United States. So again, I think we have to be mindful of that when we make decisions about gun policy. Not a one-dimensional issue. Again, my colleagues covered this. Most gun violence in this country is suicide, not homicide. When it comes to homicide, the majority of both victims and offenders are people of color. I do acknowledge that is a very complex issue, a multifaceted issue. It's not a simple issue. But that's where the majority of the gun violence problem in terms of homicide lives. Mass shootings. I'm going to talk about those today, and it's a little bit disingenuous, I suppose, because it is a small part of the gun violence problem. Depending on how you define mass shooting, between 0.2 and 3%, 0.2 is the FBI numbers, 3% is a number of a research organization, are gun homicide victims in mass shootings. And most gun homicides are kind of typical crimes, drug deals, robberies, relationship violence, which my colleague focused on, not the types of tragedies that happened at MSU and at Oxford High School, and assault rifles. Okay? We hear a lot about those, of course. Politicians talk about that a lot. The news talks about that a lot. Less than 5% of gun homicides are with assault rifles. We don't know exactly how many. The FBI tracks rifles as a category. They don't distinguish between hunting rifles and assault rifles, but it's probably on the order of 2 or 3%, although we're not absolutely sure. Some of the trends. We're buying more and more guns in America. Americans are, the number of guns is steadily increasing. In fact, during recent Democratic administrations, it increased more than during recent Republican administrations. Having said that, in terms of what crime has done over the same time period, it's been quite inconsistent. Between 1990 and about 2014, again, I know one of my colleagues mentioned that year, it went down a lot. It declined by about 2/3 violent crime. So more guns in the country, less violent crime. In 2014, disturbingly to all of us, I think, that trend reversed. Crime started edging up. Why did it do that? There's a huge discussion amongst criminologists. Some folks say it's the isolation, substance abuse associated with COVID. Some say it's a mental illness issue. Some say it's a racism, bigotry, class issue. Some say it's the drug cartels and the fentanyl epidemic. Some say it's soft on crime policies on the part of left-wing legislators, judges, prosecutors. I think, my own personal take on that is the answer is yes. It's probably in part each of those things. Certainly I think COVID has had a huge effect on gun violence and all types of violence. But we've had an inconsistent relationship between gun violence and number of firearms purchased and number of firearms owned. Negligent or accidental firearms death, good news on that front. They've declined a lot since 1980. They've declined to about 1/5 of what they were in 1980, so there's some positive news. Another interesting fact that I think we really need to be aware of. A lot easier for a person to carry a gun today than it was back in 1986. The red and the yellow on the map, I know the writing is tiny. The red and the yellow on the map are places where it was difficult to carry a firearm or impossible to carry a firearm back in 1986. Green and blue is where it's easy to carry a firearm in 2022. There's been a huge change. Many more Americans are carrying firearms. Okay? And yet, if guns and the absolute number of guns being carried or owned was the problem, we would have expected a huge surge in gun violence, and we haven't seen that. Again, we've had this inconsistent relationship. So in general, and so far I've talked about the issue in general, I'm going to talk about the issue of mass shooting specifically in the tail end of my presentation. But in general, I think the most important message we can glean from all of this is we have to change our thinking. Okay? We have to change our thinking from the number of firearms is a problem, the number of gun owners is a problem, the number of guns being produced or sold is a problem, to thinking about whose hands are those guns in. Okay? If they're in the right hands, okay? If there were a police officer in the room right now with a firearm on his, her, or their hip, I don't think any of us would be worried about that. In fact, if we are the victims of crime, we want those individuals showing up. Okay? Our decision makers, our governor, our president, our senators, our legislators, they're protected by people with guns. Okay? So, number of guns isn't the issue. I would respectfully suggest to you that the real issue, the real metric we should focus on is the ratio of, and I know I'm grossly simplifying using this terminology, but the ratio of good guy guns to bad guy guns. Okay? Firearms in the hands of the right people not only doesn't increase crime and gun violence, I think there's actually good research evidence to suggest it decreases it. So we want to maximize that ratio. We want to maximize the ratio of firearms in the hands of non-crime prone, law-abiding, well-trained individuals, minimize the number of firearms in the hands of the bad guys, the high-risk individuals who are likely to use them for nefarious purposes. Last slide is really just a sum up of the things that I said. Probably don't need to repeat those points. Other than perhaps the last one, it's going to be the segue into my discussion of mass shootings. When we think about policy, I think we've got an obligation to ask ourselves two questions right off the outset. What's the theory and what's the evidence? Okay? Is there a sound, criminological, political science, psychological, social work, professional theory that says, you know what, if we do this, we're going to address the root causes of this particular firearms problem, and it's likely to work. If there isn't, we're probably going down a blind alley. We're going to pursue a policy that's going to be ineffective. Okay, so that's question number one. Question number two, evidence. Right? Evidence-based policy is the buzzword. Is there empirical evidence out there, previous studies, that show when somebody did this, somebody in a similar situation, and that part's really important, right? What works in Australia, what works in Great Britain, what works in my home country of Canada, where there are not 1/10 the firearms in the United States, may not work here. So is there evidence that in a similar situation, and my colleague is absolutely right, US is great for this, 50 natural laboratories we could use, that it actually has worked. Okay. So, respect to mass shootings, what happened at MSU, what happened at Oxford, what happened in a number of other places, I'm going to propose a theory and an approach to you. This is a well-known criminological theory. It's called routine activities theory, RAT theory, if you want a mnemonic to remember it. Developed by Cohen and Felsen back in the 1970s. It's a very simple theory, but I think it's a really powerful theory for the issue of mass shootings. It says, crime's going to happen when three things intersect. Okay? The three things are, you need a motivated offender, somebody who's motivated to commit the crime. You need a suitable target, okay? And that, of course, is going to vary by the nature of the crime. And the third thing is you need a lack of capable guardianship. Okay? And the beauty of the theory and the power of the theory is if you take away just one of those three things, you can stop the crime. Okay? So let's think about how routine activities theory applies to the issue of mass shootings. Motivated offenders. Okay? My colleagues talked a little bit about this. Who are mass shooters? They are typically people who are angry. They are really angry at someone or some group of someone's. They feel, from their perspective, they've been wrong. They've suffered an injustice, and they're going to let you know about it. They're going to let those people know about it. They're going to let society know about it. Right? They're going to get revenge, and they're going to make a statement. Many of these individuals are mentally ill. So I don't mean to imply that their sense of injustice makes sense, or it's accurate, or it's actually just. But in their minds, they feel they've suffered an injustice, so they're going to lash out against the target of their injustice. Unfortunately, the research tells us it's hard to predict who those individuals are going to be. We know the risk factors. Okay? Again, my colleague did a wonderful job of talking about that. But the reality is, there's a very high false positive rate. If I showed you 100 people that have all the risk factors, maybe one of them would commit a mass shooting. Now, in a global sense, that's wonderful. Right? We'd be much worse off if all of them did, or half of them did. But it creates a challenge for us as policymakers. How do you pick out that one person? Okay? It's hard to know who the genuinely motivated individual is going to be, as opposed to those who just blow hot air in terms of what they say or how they act. Number two, suitable targets. Sadly, folks who work in the security industry, who work in homeland security, tell us there's an almost infinite number of soft targets in this country. If you want to commit a mass shooting in a mall, in a school, not a lot of security in those places, and there's an infinite number of them. If you want to target a particular group, women, immigrants, the LGBTQ community, whomever it may be that you have an issue with, again, there's an almost infinite number of places where you can do that. So figuring out what the suitable target might be is also very difficult. Certainly the availability of firearms in this country matters, but I do want to share with you that mass shootings, with all due respect to our former president, President Obama, mass shootings are not a uniquely American phenomenon. Just had one in Germany last week, where a person shot up a Jehovah's Witness meeting hall. We have them in Canada, in my home country. We have them in all countries. And if you are a mass killer and you can't get access to a gun, there are plenty of other weapons you could use. Nice, France, 80 some odd individuals died because a person drove a truck through a crowd. Explosives, right? Oklahoma City. Here we have a violent extremist, has an agenda, commits a mass murder. I don't remember the exact number of deaths, but 160 some odd. I know I'm running short of time. Okay, so really tough to predict the first two things. But we can do something about the third one. Capable guardianship. Okay? Can we supply capable guardianship in places? Run, fight, hide. You've probably all heard that refrain. It's the FBI's active shooter protocol. Okay? Let's think about each one very briefly. Run. Good tactic. Okay? I recommend to folks, my wife is an elementary school teacher, I recommended to her, should she ever hear that sound, we can't imagine, but pop, 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 pop in another room, open up the windows to your classroom, run. Okay? Why? You want to get away from that mass shooter. It's hard to hit a moving target. Any of us who shoot know that. And if you do get hit and you get to prompt medical attention, you're likely going to survive. If you choose the hide option and you're hit, tragically, many victims wait an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours for medical help. Many victims die as a result of bleeding out because they can't get medical attention. So I often suggest to people, unless you are absolutely certain you can find a secure location, you're better off choosing the run option than the hide option. But the one I think we really ought to think about is fight. Okay? What is my university? What is MSU? What do most people tell their students, their staff, their faculty? When you're going to fight, pick up a book. Throw a book at the mass shooter. Pick up a ruler. Pick up your backpack. with all due respect, folks, we can do an awful lot better than that. The most effective way to resist a mass shooter is with a firearm. We can rely on law enforcement to do that, and that's typically what happens, but law enforcement can't be everywhere because there are only 1 million or so licensed police officers in the entire United States. Okay? Sounds like a lot, but considering it's a country of 335 million, it really isn't. We do, however, here in Michigan, have about 900,000 people, almost as many, licensed to carry concealed firearms. Okay? And I think that is the most obvious avenue for capable guardianship. Okay? CPLs in Michigan receive mandatory training. We receive background checks. We are fingerprinted. Many CPLs have additional training. Many have a law enforcement background or a military background. Statistics tell us we are an extraordinarily law-abiding group. We actually have a lower rate of offending than sworn police officers. We are less likely to hit an innocent bystander when we do shoot than police officers. And there is a record of successful incidences where CPLs and people who are properly licensed to carry firearms have stopped mass shooting situations. I'm not terribly confident in the data that the last statement comes from, but there is some data out there that shows the difference that it makes when somebody who's on scene stops a mass shooting as opposed to waiting for the police to arrive, stage, and then go in is about 10 lives. Okay? And I want you to think back to that first slide. 10 lives could be saved if somebody on scene responds. Okay? Let's skip ahead to the last point. Make it personal. I want everybody to think about this. Really think about this. As we were speaking, as you were eating lunch, you hear pop, 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 pop. You hear screaming in the building. What policy of the ones that are going to be discussed, that were discussed by my colleagues, that the legislature is going to be talking about, what policy is most likely to save your life? Okay. Is it a gun control policy? Is it a red flag policy? Is it focusing on the firearms industry? Is it changing the law? Or is it acknowledging a disturbing reality, but a reality nonetheless, that the only way we might be able to stop a mass shooter who walks into this room is if somebody in this room is carrying a firearm and is prepared to be a capable guardian? I would respectfully suggest we really need to take that possibility seriously. Thank you for your time, including the overtime that I think I took.
All right, we have a lot of information on the table. I don't know if we have a walking mic available, so that might mean you have to speak up a bit. So, but I will take the first question from Emily.
Hello, Representative Emily Dievendorf. I just wanted to note a couple of things before I ask my question. The images used in the slide to illustrate wanting to have guns in the hands of good guys as opposed to bad guys perpetuate stereotypes about who has the guns and who is committing the violence that are exactly why folks are concerned about being red flagged in ERPO laws, which doesn't mean we don't want ERPO laws. It does mean we need to guard against bias. And just as most gun owners are responsible gun owners, we know most folks with mental health issues also aren't violent. That doesn't mean that we don't supply more resources to mental health. It doesn't mean we don't ensure that we don't create easy access to guns. And mass shootings don't have to be unique to America for the normalcy of mass shootings, which includes daily gun violence, to be a uniquely American problem. So considering all of that, I would love to know if there are states that have really great model policies that include clauses to guard against bias in gun laws and especially ERPO laws, and ensure that there is equitable application and enforcement. in ERPO laws, because we do have so many community members that are disproportionately impacted by discrimination and that kind of negative stereotyping that we unfortunately saw on that slide, that are concerned about being targeted by these laws that can accomplish a lot of good. Are there states that we should be looking to for those clauses? And I'd love to hear from one of our, the first couple
Yeah,
of
let's start with
us.
April on that.
So one of the things you mentioned was the mentally ill and the stereotype that people who are mentally ill commit a lot of mass shootings. They don't. They don't commit a lot of violence against others. People who are mentally ill, if they do engage in violence, it's generally self-directed. Yes, so they may be more likely to attempt suicide. But Oregon, their extremist protection order law specifically states that mental health status should not be a factor in deciding whether someone gets an extremist protection order. It's all about a person's risky behaviors. If a person is engaging in behaviors that identify them as willing to use violence against themselves or others, so if they have committed violence against somebody else, if they are threatening a school shooting, that's what the extremist protection order needs to be based on. If on a chance that they have a mental illness, well, that doesn't really matter. It's the behaviors that they're engaging in that matters. So Oregon is a model there. As far as racial bias, it's really hard to legislate ending racial bias, and so I haven't seen any state that can really figure that out. But there are attempts underway to do some things that might, kind of hook into that. For example, extremist protection orders. Some states like California, they've written into the law that if you already possess an illegal gun and you're under an extremist protection order, you can turn that illegal gun in and not be prosecuted for it. And that can get at a proliferation of illegal guns that are on the street and the fact that they might be in the hands of Black and brown individuals. Another thing that Black and brown communities I've heard very concerned about is what happens when somebody comes to the door, when law enforcement come to your door to have a gun relinquished. And one of the concerns is that they'll see something else, in the house, and then they'll, say, well, that's in plain sight, and it'll become a criminal investigation if they see something that they think, could be evidence of some criminal pursuit. And, some states have said this is not, an extremist protection order is not an investigatory tool. It is a life-saving tool. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to engage in search when we go to have a gun relinquished. So that's what I've seen other states do.
Can I address that as well, since the slide was in my presentation?
Okay.
So if I may, ma'am, and I apologize, I know you introduced yourself. I am absolutely horrible with remembering names after...
Representative Dievendorf.
Okay. Could you let me know what you felt was stereotypical about that particular slide?
Yes, everything.
Okay. Well, that's a broad answer, but
in particular, the visual description of the individuals. It's overall, their uses of descriptions that are still perpetuated in order to seat most of the gun violence problems with particular communities, and honestly, I feel like it's pretty obvious.
Well, so I put some thought into picking that particular graphic. Chose two individuals who are of, I would assume, the same gender, who are, I assume, the same racial category, simply to try to avoid that very problem. We have an offender who I think looks like a white male. We have a law-abiding citizen who also is a white male. In part because, particularly if you include suicides, older white men are most likely to be the victims of gun violence, and most gun violence is committed by white males. So that was why I chose this particular graphic to illustrate the issue of good guys versus bad guys. So I really did make an effort to avoid stereotyping, given the image, but I'm always open to criticism.
I appreciate the effort. A lot has to do with the actual images of the individuals and not just all of the associations that we expect people to get. If we dig into nuance, we have to consider what people are absorbing in looking at a stereotypical image based on dress, based on race, based on all of those different things. And you have one with the name criminal on it that is wearing clothing that is more often to be seen in urban areas and is less likely to be worn by white people. And the person is labeled a criminal. I just want to flag that as something that harmfully perpetuates stereotypes.
Fair enough.
I appreciate your being open to that.
Yeah, one last thing that I wanted to say, because it came up in the discussion. In terms of mentally ill people being mass shooters, I absolutely agree with my colleague that the vast majority of mentally ill folks not only don't commit mass shootings, they don't commit any violence at all. It's simply one of the parts of the profile. But that was actually the whole point of that part of the presentation. There's an incredibly high false positive rate. Even if you have all of those points of data, trying to predict who is going to be the mass shooter is extremely difficult to do. So I think there's actually a lot of agreement in terms of what we may be saying. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Ben, this question?
Yeah, this is kind of a broad question, so bear with me here. But you all have been researching this issue for quite a long time. The perception is, whether that's backed up by statistics or not, that mass shootings are increasing, or at the very least becoming more costly in terms of public safety and well-being. Based on past shooting events compared to the most recent one on MSU's campus, and the fact that we're seeing this law lab mentality really flourish in the wake of Roe v. Wade being struck down and the various abortion laws, is this the moment that states actually make an impact in preventing gun violence through legislation? And more importantly, is Michigan going to be a leader in this? I'm just wondering what your guys' perceptions are on that.
Could have asked Representative.
Yeah, no, I should have.
I saw Representative Brixey was here before too.
Sure. If anyone would like to broach that, would be appreciated.
I mean, we can. We're speculating.
Sure.
Here,
Absolutely.
I think that the issue of gun policy is one of those polarizing issues that divides the political parties. There's a lot of pent-up demand among Democrats to do something, as represented by the fact that bills have been proposed in past sessions over and over and over again, so that in some respects, Oxford and MSU, we're not looking at incident-driven policy proposals. What we're looking, which is what we talk about in public policy sometimes, we're looking at incidents that are now giving some extra political momentum to what was going to go forward based on the pent-up demand in the Democratic Party now that there's alignment between both houses and the governor. The governor only cited 3 things in her state of the state, and those are the things that we've seen going through the legislature that's being talked about. There are other proposals that are obviously being worked on as well to, make sure guns stay away from polling places. And of course, we remember a lot of dissatisfaction with the fact that guns are allowed, we're allowed in the state capitol and then open carries. So I would expect there's going to be action on some other things, but it is completely unknown whether the Democratic leadership will push other things beyond these 3, which have a lot of public popularity, given the narrowness of the Democratic majorities in each chamber. There are going to be individual Democrats in very close districts who may not go for some of the things that some of their Democratic colleagues would go for. We already know some of them are being threatened with recall. And if you look at political science literature on legislatures, the #1 motivation of legislators is gaining re-election. right? So there'll be people who would vote for things because they say that's the best policy for the state, and if I don't win next time, so be it. But there's others who may be thinking, I have value in here, I shouldn't sacrifice myself on this one issue, there's other things to be accomplished in education and elsewhere. And that's why I think there's a significant unknown here. But it's a completely different moment. And honestly, it all goes back to the 2018 ballot issue that got rid of gerrymandering. But for that, we would still have a blockade from having even legislative hearings and discussions on any proposal that did anything with firearms other than expand access. So it's a unique moment for Michigan. And the other thing we face, and certainly some of the discussion we've talked here, is federalism provides these 50 laboratories so we can look at other states. Federalism also defeats their neighbors' gun laws. Some of the studies of Chicago, the numbers of guns used in crime that could be traced to 1 or 2 gun shops in Gary, Indiana, is staggering, So this is one of the difficulties of a country designed on the federalist model. I have very modest expectations about what will be ultimately accomplished, both in terms of the amount of legislation and the empirical impact. But I do think that these are things that will reduce risk and harm in some circumstances. The issue of mass shootings, we can spend a lot of time on that. It's already been pointed out, right? Fairly low amount. But look at a place like MSU. Guy steps into a classroom, shoots people from behind. Had a police officer been sitting there, it wouldn't have mattered for the kids in that room. Maybe it would have stopped walking down to the Union, or maybe the officer would have been hit. There's great uncertainty about that. And that's why I prefer to focus on what are these areas, such as Dr. Zeoli's research, where we may be able to focus on having guns not in the hands of somebody who may in fact be a good guy and reaches a moment of rage and becomes momentarily a bad guy with access to a firearm in a family interpersonal conflict situation. So I think it's very unknown what exactly is going to happen beyond these 3 laws that seem headed down the road.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, we'll take both.
Hi, I've never done this before. Anthony Longo. For the professors, with research, they keep saying that gun violence is the leading cause of death among children. With Giffords, Everytown, and the Gun Violence Archive, those numbers, and this has changed recently, I haven't had a chance to look, include children, and it says ages up to 19. Now, with your research, do you include children above the age of 18? Because myself, I'm a veteran, I enlisted at 17. At 19, I was in Afghanistan. And theoretically, I could have been included, gun violence, and that's, I don't know as far as, collegiate level. With you, does that number change? Are those numbers different?
Yeah, so I don't pay attention to the stuff that comes from advocacy groups. I pay attention to the scientists' work. And the research on gun deaths among children that is often cited comes from my colleagues at the University of Michigan. And the published research thus far did look at kids age 0 to 19, and the reason they did that, was because the United Nations and the World Health Organization classifies people as children up to the age of 19. However, due to this criticism, which has come a lot in the past couple weeks, the numbers were recrunched, and it stands if you go to the age of 17. So 0 to 17, firearm injuries are still the leading cause of death of children.
Oh, yeah, a couple of comments and a question. I thought when I listened to the first 3 speakers that the presentation was very biased on one side. It was not objective at all. Thank goodness this fourth fellow came in and talked and provided, I thought, more objective information that helps us to understand the situation. I was curious about, what is the reason for the Second Amendment? A lot of this conversation is talking about the Second Amendment, but not why is there a Second Amendment? I think a lot of it is based on the fear of tyranny and the citizens be able to counteract the government's attempt to become more tyrannical. I didn't hear the list of the 3 proposed legislation. I mean, what are they specifically, so the audience knows what is being proposed? I have some understanding of it, and I think some of these legislators, really the left-wing ones, want to get rid of firearms altogether. And that's a real concern for me. And then the last thing is just a question. States that have constitutional carry or permit more easy access and more people carrying firearms, what's the incidence of violence with firearms versus these more restrictive states and all these free fire, what we call schools, or kind of free fire zones? So what is the incidence of violence with firearms in these states with constitutional carry, for example, versus states that don't have constitutional carry?
So I'll take at least some of that, helping you understand what the 3 bills are in the legislature. One is an extremist protection order bill, and my talk kind of went through those. Something I didn't mention is that the research has found that extremist protection order laws are associated with reductions in suicide as well. Another of the bills is a permit to purchase or purchaser licensing law that extends background checks and licensing to long guns in addition to handguns, and for when you're buying a gun from a private seller and a licensed firearm dealer. And the research shows that those laws are associated with reductions in suicide, homicide, shooting deaths of police officers, and states that have these purchaser licensing laws have lower rates of mass shootings than states that don't have those purchaser licensing laws. The third bill is a child access protection law that says that if you have a child under the age of 18 in your house, you have to keep your firearm stored in a way that the child can't get to it. And that is locked and unloaded. And research of all the firearm laws that have been studied, this one has the most evidence supporting it in terms of lives saved. This one is associated with reductions in childhood homicide, childhood firearms, childhood suicide, childhood unintentional firearm deaths, and I forget what the 4th thing is, but there's a 4th thing.
Unintentional injuries.
Unintentional, yes. So these laws do have a strong evidence base behind them, and I forget what the other part of your question was.
I had a number of them. Why is there a Second Amendment?
I can talk about that in a minute. Well, do you want to address the one about?
Sorry, I think we're over time, so I actually want to leave the last word to Kelly Sampson since she hasn't spoken in the Q&A.
Yeah, just in regards to why is there a Second Amendment. So I don't know if I said this, I'm also an attorney at Brady and I work on our constitutional issues. So a few important things to know about the history of the Second Amendment. First, among the constitutional amendments that were debated at the convention, that one has some of the least legislative history available because it wasn't that important to them, frankly, in the way that they were drafting those amendments. That being said, and if I mischaracterize anything, let me know. But that being said, the purpose of the Second Amendment was to preserve the right to have militia service at the time. And so there was actually at one point, one of the things that they did debate to the extent that there was legislative history available was whether or not they should have an exemption for conscientious objectors. Because they always understood this to be an amendment that would allow individuals to partake in military service. And the reason why that was important at the time is because in this new country, the federal government was pretty weak. I mean, right now in 2023, it can be really difficult for us to understand and sort of conceive of a time when the federal government wasn't powerful. But when the country was first founded, especially coming after the failure of the Articles of Confederation, federal government didn't have a lot of power. And they needed to be able to do something about that. And if you look, so one of the things you asked about was tyranny, and thank you for raising that, because it's something that comes up a lot. But if you actually look at what happened in the early country, The Second Amendment was in no way a right for people to sort of arm themselves to engage in tyranny against the government. It was actually the opposite, and the Whiskey Rebellion is a good example of that. When early Americans decided that they didn't want to comply with one of the laws, they took up arms against the government. And what George Washington did, and I'm so sorry, I haven't looked at a lot of this materials in a minute, so I'm calling my memory, so if I misname anything, sorry about that. But the concept, I know for sure, is that he drew on the militia to support him as in protecting the federal government. So rather than protecting tyranny, it actually is the opposite, and it was a way to sort of preserve the government. So I'll leave it there. I didn't leave off, but.
So unfortunately, there's another event in this room after us, and so that has to be the last word, but I think some of the speakers may be willing to stick around for a little bit. If you have additional questions, you can come up and say hello. Thank you for attending, and we will hope to see you next month.